The mist hangs low over the frigid waters of the North Sea. Dawn breaks, revealing silhouettes on the horizon. Sleek, dragon-headed vessels, cutting through waves with impossible speed, they approach from the direction no ship should come, directly against the prevailing wind. The year is 820 CE, and for coastal communities across Europe, these vessels herald a new age of maritime dominance. What makes these Nordic ships different is not just their striking appearance, but a revolutionary design that would transform naval warfare and exploration for centuries to come. In the stillness before full daylight, the wooden vessels seem to whisper across the water's surface, defying the very elements that constrained all other seafarers of the age. Before we begin this journey into the Viking Age, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always fascinating to see our community of history lovers spread across the world. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Every subscription helps us keep exploring the real stories behind the legends. Now let's begin. Imagine standing on the shores of Northumbria or Wessex in the early 9th century. For generations, you have known the rhythms of maritime travel, ships that sail with the wind, that require deep harbors, that move at the mercy of weather and tide. The sea itself provided protection. Certain approaches were impossible. Certain winds meant safety. Then one morning, everything changes. Ships appear where they shouldn't be able to go, moving against winds that pin local vessels to shore, navigating shallow waters that would ground any other craft, and landing directly on beaches rather than requiring harbors. The Vikings had arrived, and with them a maritime technology that would rewrite the rules of naval power. The security of distance and difficult approaches, assumptions that had shaped settlement patterns for centuries, suddenly meant nothing. The world before the Viking expansion was one of relative maritime predictability. Mediterranean vessels, descendants of Roman and Greek designs, were heavy, deep-keeled ships dependent on favorable winds and established ports. Square-sailed vessels could move with following winds but struggled against contrary breezes. The cumbersome bireme and trireme designs of antiquity had given way to simpler merchant vessels, but the fundamental limitations remained. The Frankish kingdoms, Slavic peoples, and Anglo-Saxon realms all utilized ships that followed similar principles. Naval movement was constrained by geography and weather. Coastal communities built their defenses with these constraints in mind, often positioning settlements where approach by sea was difficult, or establishing watchtowers only along predictable routes. The Norse, however, growing up in a land of fjords, islands, and challenging shorelines, had been perfecting a fundamentally different approach to shipbuilding for generations. The story of the Viking longship begins not in the age of raids, but centuries earlier in the misty fjords of Scandinavia. Archaeological evidence shows that the Nordic peoples had been developing distinctive ship designs as early as the 4th century CE. The Nidem ship, discovered in Denmark and dating to around 320 CE, already shows the emergence of a clinker-built hull and a symmetrical design that would later evolve into the classic longship. These early vessels were primarily rowing boats, but they contained the DNA of the revolution to come: lightweight construction, flexible hulls, and shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate both open seas and inland waterways. The Kvalsund ship, dating to around 700 CE, reveals further refinements, including a rudimentary keel that improves stability while maintaining the shallow draft essential for beach landings. Each discovery shows an evolutionary process, with each generation of shipwrights learning from and improving upon the work of their predecessors. Life in the North shaped every aspect of Norse society, including their relationship with the sea. The harsh landscapes of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, with their mountain ranges, dense forests, and fractured coastlines, made land travel difficult. Rivers, fjords, and coastal waterways became the highways of Norse society, necessitating vessels that could navigate these diverse conditions. The sea wasn't just a barrier to be crossed. It was the primary connection between communities. Children grew up learning to row and sail almost as soon as they could walk. Maritime skills weren't specialized knowledge. They were fundamental to northern life. Even farmers needed to understand boats, as fishing supplemented agricultural produce, and travel to markets often required water transport. The sagas tell of Norse children playing with toy boats, learning to read weather patterns, and competing in small vessel races from an early age, preparation for lives that would be inextricably linked to maritime travel. The traditional Nordic homelands offered limited agricultural land. Communities clustered along the coasts, where fishing supplemented farming. The rich marine resources of the North Atlantic, cod, herring, whale, and seal, provided both sustenance and trade goods. The sea provided not just food but identity. The Norse creation myths themselves speak of the world emerging from the void, Ginnungagap, with the oceans holding a central place in their cosmology. The god Njord governed the sea and maritime prosperity, while the goddess Ran claimed those lost to the waves. Thor himself battled the Midgard serpent in the depths of the ocean. This intimate relationship with the ocean permeated their spiritual lives, their social structures, and ultimately their technological innovations. The longship wasn't merely a tool, it was an expression of Norse identity and values, combining practical utility with artistic beauty and spiritual significance. Winter in the north was a time of preparation. The long, dark months when sailing was impossible became the shipbuilding season. In coastal communities, the rhythmic sounds of axes and adzes shaping oak planks would fill the air. Shipwrights, whose knowledge had been passed down through generations, directed teams of workers in the complex process of vessel construction. The work began with the selection of trees. Not just any oak would do. Shipbuilders sought trees with natural curves that could be shaped into specific components of the vessel. The all-important keel required a single piece of oak with just the right curvature, while the stems at bow and stern needed wood with more dramatic bends. The search for these specific trees might take men deep into forests, where they would carefully assess each potential specimen before the laborious process of felling and transporting the massive trunks back to coastal construction sites. By the late 8th century, the Norse had perfected what we now recognize as the classic Viking longship. These vessels weren't just improvements on existing designs. They represented a fundamentally different approach to maritime travel. The key innovations began with the hull itself. Unlike the Mediterranean tradition of building the internal frame first and then attaching planking, Norse shipwrights used the clinker-built or lapstrake method. Overlapping wooden planks formed the hull first, with the internal frame added later. This shell-first construction created a lightweight, flexible vessel that could flex with the waves rather than fighting against them. Each oak plank was split, not sawn, along the grain, preserving the natural strength of the wood fibers. The resulting strakes were then shaped with axes and planes until they fit precisely against their neighbors. Iron rivets and wooden pegs secured the overlapping edges, with wool or animal hair soaked in pine tar inserted between planks for waterproofing. The resulting hull was both lighter and stronger than contemporary European designs. The keel, the spine of any ship, was another area of innovation. Viking longships featured a shallow keel that reduced draft while still providing directional stability. This seemingly simple design choice had profound implications. While other European vessels required deep harbors, longships could navigate shallow rivers and beach directly on shorelines. No ports were required, no warning of arrival would be given. The vessels could appear, discharge warriors, and depart with astonishing speed. The flexibility of approach transformed maritime warfare from a predictable contest between fleets meeting at sea into a lightning campaign of raids against coastal targets that had never before considered themselves vulnerable. Even inland communities connected to the sea by navigable rivers now lay open to attack. The psychological impact was immense. Nowhere within reach of water felt truly safe anymore. The internal structure of the longship represented another departure from Mediterranean traditions. Rather than rigid frames that created a stiff hull, Norse vessels used a series of floor timbers and beams that allowed the ship to flex and twist with the movements of the sea. This flexibility was not a weakness, but a strength. By working with the forces of wave and wind rather than against them, the longship could maintain integrity in conditions that would stress and potentially break a more rigid structure. Contemporary accounts describe longships riding over waves like a living thing, a poetic description that actually captures the engineering principle at work. The flexible hull absorbed and distributed stresses rather than concentrating them at structural weak points. This approach, developed through empirical observation rather than formal engineering principles, anticipated by centuries the design philosophy that would eventually guide modern naval architecture. Perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of longship design was the sail technology. Prior to the Viking Age, northern ships had primarily been rowing vessels. The introduction of a single square sail, likely influenced by Frisian traders, transformed these already capable vessels into true maritime predators. The sail was mounted on a mast that could be lowered when not in use, making the transition from sailing to rowing quick and efficient. But it wasn't just the presence of a sail that mattered. It was how the sail worked with the unique hull design. The sail itself was made of wool woven on large upright looms by the women of Norse communities. The Oseberg burial included fragments of such sails, revealing a complex weaving pattern that created a strong yet flexible cloth. Modern reconstructions suggest that these woolen sails, when treated with a mixture of animal fat and pine tar, were remarkably efficient, capturing wind energy while allowing enough airflow to prevent excessive tilting of the vessel. The combination of the clinker-built hull, flexible construction, and the square sail created vessels with remarkable performance. Most revolutionary was their ability to sail close to the wind, to travel in directions nearly opposite to the prevailing wind direction. While the square sail might seem primitive compared to later triangular lateen sails used in the Mediterranean, the Vikings compensated with superior hull design and sailing techniques. By using the side force generated when the wind hit the sail at an angle, and countering this with their keel design, they could achieve what sailors call beating, zigzagging against the wind to make progress in a direction that would be impossible for other contemporary vessels. Modern reconstructions and sailing trials with replica Viking ships have demonstrated that these vessels could sail within about 60 degrees of the wind, not as close as modern yachts with their triangular Bermuda rigs, but dramatically better than other ships of their era, which typically required winds at least 80-90 degrees off their bows. The sailing abilities of the longship were complemented by their rowing capacity. Each vessel typically carried 25 to 60 oarsmen, depending on size, providing reliable propulsion when winds were unfavorable or when precise maneuvering was required. The alternating use of sail and oar power gave longships unmatched versatility. They could maintain progress in virtually any conditions, switching seamlessly between power sources as conditions demanded. In practical terms, this meant that Viking crews could maintain schedules and complete journeys that other seafarers would consider impossible. While Mediterranean or Frankish captains might wait days or weeks for favorable winds before departing, Norse navigators could set off regardless of conditions, confident in their ability to make progress through a combination of sailing and rowing. The Norse shipwrights achieved this engineering marvel without modern mathematics, physics, or material science. Their approach was empirical, refined through generations of trial and error, with knowledge passed from master to apprentice. Each shipwright might add small innovations, adjusting curves and proportions based on the performance of previous vessels. The result was a continuously evolving tradition rather than a fixed design. Regional variations emerged. The warships of Danish raiders differed somewhat from the trading vessels of Swedish merchants or the exploration craft of Norwegian settlers. The shipwright held a position of high status in Norse society, combining practical skill with what we might today call artistic vision. The ship was both tool and symbol, its creation a blend of engineering and sacred craft. The most renowned shipwrights were celebrated in sagas alongside great warriors and kings, a testament to the cultural value placed on this specialized knowledge. We know the details of these ships not just from historical accounts, but from remarkable archaeological discoveries. The Gokstad ship, discovered in a burial mound in Norway in 1880, dates to around 890 CE and stands as one of the best preserved examples. Nearly 24 meters long and 5 meters wide, it could carry a crew of around 35 men. With 16 pairs of oars and a single square sail of approximately 110 square meters, it combined speed, capacity, and maneuverability in a package that other European shipwrights simply couldn't match. When the Gokstad ship was excavated, archaeologists found it contained not just the vessel itself, but a complete set of equipment: oars, a gangplank for shore landings, wooden tent poles and stakes for setting up camp, cooking equipment, and even 3 smaller boats that would have been carried on deck. This discovery revealed not just the ship's construction, but its complete operational context, a self-contained system for projection of Norse power and presence across vast distances. The Ulfberht ship, found in another Norwegian burial mound in 1904 and dating to around 820 CE, provides further insights. Slightly smaller but more ornately decorated, it demonstrates that these vessels were not just functional tools, but expressions of art, status, and cultural identity. The elaborate wood carvings, including the famous dragonhead prow, served practical purposes as well. They announced the status and intentions of the crew, and some Vikings believed they housed protective spirits that would guide the ship safely through treacherous waters. The animal heads mounted on prows were removable, taken down when approaching friendly settlements to signal peaceful intentions. The carving techniques developed for these decorative elements influenced Norse art across media, from stone sculpture to metalwork, creating a distinctive aesthetic that we still recognize as characteristically Viking today. The Skuldelev ships, discovered in Roskilde in Denmark in 1962, expanded our understanding of Norse vessel diversity. This find included 5 distinct vessels deliberately scuttled around 1070 CE to block a navigation channel. Among them were specialized warships, trading vessels, and coastal ferries, revealing the breadth of the Norse maritime tradition. The Skuldelev II, a longship built in Dublin around 1042 CE, demonstrates how the Norse adapted their designs to local materials and conditions as they established settlements across Europe. Built primarily of oak but incorporating some pine planking, it shows both the persistence of traditional construction methods and pragmatic flexibility in material selection. The Skuldelev finds also revealed the existence of sea stallions, larger warships capable of carrying up to 100 warriors, representing the pinnacle of Viking naval power. These archaeological treasures confirm what contemporary chronicles described with fear and wonder. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that in the late 8th century came dreadful forewarnings over the land of the Northumbrians, terrifying the people most woefully. These were immense sheets of light rushing through the air, and whirlwinds, and fiery dragons flying across the firmament. While some of this description might be attributed to celestial phenomena like auroras or meteorites, the fiery dragons almost certainly refer to the approaching longships with their serpent prows, cutting through the morning mist. The monk Alcuin of York wrote to King Ethelred of Northumbria after the Lindisfarne raid, lamenting, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments." The psychological impact of these raids was amplified by their seemingly supernatural speed and unpredictability, attributes made possible by the superior technology of the longship. The construction of a longship represented a massive investment of resources and skilled labor. The largest vessels required up to 12 mature oak trees, precious resources in the northern climate where trees grow slowly. Each plank had to be split, not sawn, from the log, following the natural grain of the wood to maximize strength while minimizing weight. Iron nails and rivets, each one handcrafted by skilled blacksmiths, held the structure together. The sail itself represented months of women's labor, with approximately 80 square meters of woolen cloth requiring spinning and weaving by hand. Ropes made from walrus hide or hemp provided the critical rigging. The total labor investment for a large longship might reach 40,000 hours, equivalent to 20 skilled workers laboring for a full year. This substantial investment explains why ships were often owned collectively by communities or by wealthy chieftains who could command the necessary resources and labor. This investment paid dividends in performance. A well-crewed longship could achieve speeds of 10 to 15 knots under sail, comparable to modern recreational sailboats. Under oars, they could maintain 5-7 knots for hours, with burst speeds higher still. These numbers might seem abstract, but their practical implications were profound. Longships could outrun most other vessels of their era, choosing when and where to engage. They could strike with little warning and retreat before a substantial defense could be mounted. A typical day's journey might cover 75 to 125 nautical miles, allowing Vikings to cross from Norway to Scotland in as little as 2 days with favorable conditions. Even under adverse conditions, their ability to maintain progress through rowing meant that journey times remained relatively predictable, a critical advantage for planning military operations or trading expeditions. The crew of a longship lived in remarkably close quarters. The vessel provided no cabins or private spaces. Men slept on their sea chests or on the deck itself, protected from the elements by woolen tents erected when at anchor. Each oarsman had approximately 80 centimeters of space, enough to operate his oar, but little more. Food was prepared on small braziers carried aboard or cooked on shore during overnight stops. Fresh water was carried in wooden barrels, supplemented by beer or sour milk that would keep longer than water on extended voyages. These cramped conditions fostered intense camaraderie among crew members, reinforcing the Norse cultural values of loyalty to one's fellows and stoicism in the face of discomfort. Archaeological finds from shipboard contexts include gaming pieces for taffel, a chess-like strategic board game, and musical instruments, suggesting that leisure activities helped maintain morale during long journeys. Perhaps most importantly, the Norse mariners developed navigational skills to match their superior vessels. Without magnetic compasses or accurate charts, they used a combination of celestial navigation, observation of natural phenomena, and accumulated knowledge passed down through oral tradition. They understood the migration patterns of whales and birds, the behavior of clouds over distant land, and the color changes in water that indicated depth and shoreline. Some accounts suggest they used a sunstone, a crystal that reveals the position of the sun even on overcast days through light polarization, though this remains debated among historians. More certain is their practice of reading wave patterns, recognizing how distant land masses affected swell direction and frequency. They also maintained mental maps of coastlines, memorizing distinctive mountains, headlands, and other features that could be recognized from sea. These navigational techniques, combined with their superior vessels, allowed the Norse to undertake voyages that other European sailors considered impossible. What drove the Norse to develop these remarkable vessels and venture increasingly far from their homelands? Climate played a crucial role in the Viking expansion. The period from approximately 800 to 1200 CE saw relatively warm conditions in the North Atlantic, what scientists call the medieval warm period. This climate shift improved farming conditions in Scandinavia, leading to population growth. At the same time, it reduced ice cover in northern waters, opening new sailing routes and extending the sailing season. The combination of population pressure and improved sailing conditions created both push and pull factors for expansion. Tree ring data and ice core samples from Greenland confirm this warming trend, providing scientific support for what was once considered primarily a historical phenomenon. During this period, average temperatures in the North Atlantic region may have been 1 to 2 degrees Celsius warmer than in the preceding centuries, a modest-sounding difference that translated into significantly longer growing seasons and more navigable seas. Political changes also contributed to the outward push. The late 8th century saw increasing consolidation of power in Scandinavia. As regional kings strengthened their positions, displaced chieftains and their followers sought opportunities elsewhere. The Norse social system, with its emphasis on honor, wealth, and fame, created further incentives. Young men seeking to establish themselves needed to accumulate wealth, whether through trade, raid, or both. The longship made both endeavors possible on an unprecedented scale. The inheritance system of many Norse regions, which favored the eldest son, left younger sons with the need to make their own fortunes, creating a pool of ambitious young men with martial training but limited prospects at home. For these individuals, the expanding opportunities offered by longship voyages proved irresistible. Those who returned with wealth could significantly improve their status and prospects, potentially attracting marriage alliances with powerful families or establishing their own independent farms. The first documented Viking raid on England came on June 8, 793 CE, when longships appeared off the holy island of Lindisfarne in Northumbria. The Anglo-Saxon monk Alcuin wrote that the Church of St. Tim Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. This attack on a prominent religious center sent shock waves through European Christendom. What made it particularly terrifying was not just its violence, but its unpredictability. The monastery had been considered safe due to its location, yet the Vikings' superior ships made no location truly secure. The psychological impact was amplified by the cultural and religious differences between the still pagan Norse and the Christian communities they targeted. For Christian observers, the willingness of Vikings to attack churches and monasteries, protected spaces in the European understanding, seemed to mark them as particularly savage and godless. What these observers failed to understand was that their own religious institutions, often repositories of wealth and undefended by warriors, represented particularly attractive targets to raiders seeking maximum gain with minimum risk. The initial raid on Lindisfarne was followed by attacks on the monasteries of Jarrow and Iona, establishing a pattern that would spread throughout the British Isles. The Chronicle of Simeon of Durham records that in 794 CE, the pagans from the northern region came with a naval force to Britain like stinging hornets and spread on all sides like fearful wolves, robbed, tore, and slaughtered not only beasts of burden, sheep and oxen, but even priests and deacons, and companies of monks and nuns. The similes of hornets and wolves capture both the swarming, unpredictable nature of the attacks and their perceived ferocity. Similar accounts spread throughout European chronicles of the period, creating an image of the Vikings as superhuman in their mobility and savagery, an image that persisted in European cultural memory for centuries. When the Norse raiders first appeared on English shores, the initial reaction was confusion as much as fear. Contemporary accounts suggest the local populations often had no category for these northern invaders. Were they merchants who had turned violent? Were they agents of divine punishment? The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes them simply as heathens, or sometimes as Northmen, with little understanding of their origins or motivations. This confusion was compounded by the raiders' ability to appear and disappear with astonishing speed, leaving devastation in their wake before local defenses could mobilize. The psychological warfare aspect of Viking raids should not be underestimated. Their unpredictability, generated terror disproportionate to their actual numbers. A relatively small force of warriors, perhaps 100, 200 men in 3 to 5 longships, could effectively paralyze a much larger region through the mere threat of their appearance. The technological advantage of the longship created a fundamental imbalance in the early interactions between the Vikings and their targets. Coastal communities that had enjoyed relative security due to their difficult approach suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Monasteries built on islands for isolation and protection discovered that water was no longer a barrier but a highway for attackers. The psychological impact was immense. Nowhere felt safe, and the Vikings seemed to have supernatural powers of appearance and disappearance. Early chronicles often attribute these powers to demonic assistance or divine punishment, revealing how thoroughly the Norse maritime advantage disrupted existing worldviews. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for 793 CE records unusual atmospheric phenomena. Before the Lindisfarne raid were seen fiery dragons flying in the air, suggesting that the traumatic events led people to reinterpret natural occurrences as omens of the calamity that followed. For the Norse themselves, these early raids revealed the weakness of potential targets and the effectiveness of their maritime technology. What began as opportunistic coastal raiding evolved into more ambitious operations. The flexibility of the longship allowed the Vikings to adapt their strategies based on resistance and opportunities. When coastal targets became better defended, they simply sailed further up rivers to find less protected communities. The Thames, Seine, Rhine, Elbe, and eventually rivers as distant as the Volga and Dnieper became highways for Norse expansion. The archaeological record shows that Viking activity spread rapidly through the early 9th century. Coin hoards, burial sites, and settlement evidence trace their movements along the coasts and rivers of Europe, revealing an explosion of Norse presence throughout the northern world. This expansion was made possible by a maritime technology that opened routes previously considered impassable or impractical. The chronicles of the time capture the shock and awe that longships inspired. The Annals of St. Bertin describe how Vikings sailed up the Seine to Paris in 845 with a fleet of 120 ships. The city paid a massive ransom of 7,000 pounds of silver to avoid destruction, a testament to both the military threat and the economic motivation behind many raids. Similar accounts appear throughout European records of the 9th and 10th centuries, from Ireland to Russia, from Spain to Constantinople. The Irish Annals of Ulster record Viking fleets of unprecedented size, a marine fleet of 75 ships in 849 CE, revealing the rapid scaling of Norse maritime operations. Within a few generations, what had begun as small raiding parties had evolved into substantial fleets capable of threatening major European centers of power. This escalation was enabled by the longship's unique combination of military effectiveness and relative ease of construction compared to larger Mediterranean vessels. As Norse maritime technology enabled ever more distant voyages, the cultural shock worked in both directions. The Vikings encountered diverse societies with different religions, technologies, and social structures. These encounters transformed both the Norse and those they met. In England, initial raids evolved into settlement and integration. The Danelaw, the eastern and northern parts of England where Danish law and customs held sway, became a zone of cultural exchange rather than simply conquest. Norse words entered the English language. Norse trading practices influenced economic development, and eventually, Norse settlers adopted Christianity and local customs. Archaeological evidence from settlements like Jorvik, modern York, reveals this process of cultural fusion, with artifacts showing a blend of Norse and Anglo-Saxon influences. DNA studies of modern British populations confirm substantial Norse genetic contribution, particularly in previously Viking-controlled regions, demonstrating that cultural exchange was accompanied by significant intermarriage. The longship enabled Norse expansion into the western Atlantic islands, first the Shetlands and Orkneys, then the Hebrides, Isle of Man, and Ireland. Each became not just a target for raids, but eventually a Norse settlement zone. Dublin, founded as a Norse trading post around 841 CE, grew into one of the most important commercial centers in the Western Viking world. Archaeological excavations have revealed extensive workshops, trading goods from across Europe and beyond, and evidence of shipbuilding facilities. The Norse settlers of Dublin maintained their maritime traditions, but adapted to local conditions, creating a hybrid culture that was neither fully Scandinavian nor fully Irish. Similar processes occurred throughout the Viking world, with local variations reflecting the specific cultural and environmental contexts of each region. Further west, the longship made possible what is perhaps the most remarkable achievement of Viking exploration, the discovery of North America nearly 500 years before Columbus. Around 1000 CE, Leif Erikson and other Norse explorers established a short-lived settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in what is now Newfoundland, Canada. Archaeological evidence confirms their presence, including distinctive Norse building techniques and artifacts. This incredible journey, crossing the open Atlantic with technology from the 10th century, stands as testament to both the capabilities of the longship and the courage of its crews. The settlement itself appears to have lasted only a few years, but the achievement remains one of history's great feats of exploration. The route likely took the Norse from Norway to the Faroe Islands, then to Iceland, Greenland, and finally to North America, a stepping-stone approach that broke the daunting transatlantic crossing into more manageable segments. The sagas preserve accounts of these voyages to what the Norse called Vinland. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red describe encounters with indigenous peoples they called Skraelings, likely Inuit or other Native American groups. These meetings were sometimes peaceful exchanges of goods and sometimes violent confrontations. According to the sagas, one factor that ultimately led to the abandonment of the Vinland settlement was the hostile relationship with local populations. Unlike in Europe, where the technological advantage of the longship gave Vikings decisive military superiority, in North America they faced indigenous peoples with their own highly developed survival skills and territorial knowledge. This, combined with the extreme distance from Norse support networks in Greenland and Iceland, made the North American settlements unsustainable, but they represent the furthest reach of a maritime technology that had begun in the fjords of Scandinavia. The Norse settlements in Iceland and Greenland proved more enduring. Iceland, uninhabited, except for a few Irish monks when the Vikings arrived around 870 CE, became a Norse society that has continued uninterrupted to the present day. Greenland supported Norse colonies from approximately 985 CE until the 15th century, when climate cooling during the Little Ice Age made the settlements unsustainable. Both represented maritime achievements that would have been impossible without the unique capabilities of the longship. The settlement of Iceland required crossing over 800 miles of open ocean, a journey that was remarkably routine for Norse mariners, but beyond the capability of most other European sailors of the era. Archaeological evidence from early Icelandic settlements shows that the initial colonists brought not just people, but complete agricultural systems, livestock, seeds, tools, and technologies, all transported by sea in their versatile vessels. The Greenland colonies, established by Eric the Red around 985 CE, represented an even more challenging maritime achievement. Located on the southwestern coast of the world's largest island, these settlements required navigation through ice-filled waters and careful knowledge of seasonal conditions. The eastern settlement, actually in southern Greenland, and the smaller western settlement, further north along the western coast, together housed perhaps 3,000–5,000 Norse colonists at their peak. Archaeological excavations have revealed substantial farms, churches, and a material culture that maintained strong connections to Scandinavia, despite the extreme isolation. Annual ship traffic between Greenland and Iceland or Norway was essential to the colony's survival, bringing timber, iron, and luxury goods that could not be produced locally. When climate cooling in the 14th and 15th centuries made this maritime connection increasingly difficult to maintain, the Greenland colonies went into decline and ultimately disappeared, a testament to the essential role of reliable sea travel in maintaining Norse expansion. To the east, Viking ships navigated the complex waterways of what is now Russia, establishing trading routes that connected northern Europe with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. The Volga and Dnieper rivers became highways for Norse merchants known as Rus, from whom Russia ultimately derives its name. By portaging their vessels between river systems, physically carrying them overland from one waterway to another, they created a trade network linking the Baltic to the Black and Caspian Seas. The relatively lightweight construction of the longship made such portaging feasible, though still immensely laborious. Archaeological evidence of this eastern expansion includes numerous silver coin hoards found throughout Scandinavia and the Baltic region. These collections, often containing Islamic dirhams alongside European currencies, trace the trade networks that brought silver, silk, spices, and other luxury goods from the east into northern Europe. The concentration of these finds along river routes confirms the waterways as the primary arteries of this commerce. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitus, describes this eastern route in his work De Administrando Imperio, written around 950 CE. He details how the Rus would bring their ships down the Dnieper, navigating a series of dangerous rapids to reach the Black Sea and, ultimately, Constantinople. These trading expeditions brought furs, honey, wax, and slaves from the north to exchange for silk, spices, wine, and silver. The longship made this extensive trade network possible, allowing the Norse to connect regions previously isolated from each other. The emperor's account provides specific details of the portaging process. When they reach the first rapids, they disembark the humans and keep them under guard on land, and the rest of the goods they carry around the rapids, sometimes dragging their ships, sometimes carrying them on their shoulders. This description reveals both the physical challenges of the eastern route and the determination of Norse merchants to overcome them. Arabic sources provide additional perspectives on Viking maritime activities. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered the Rus on the Volga River in 922 CE, left detailed descriptions of their ships, appearance, and customs. He noted their impressive physical stature, their elaborate rituals, and their trading practices. While sometimes critical of their hygiene and religious practices, the Norse were still largely pagan at this time, he clearly respected their capabilities as merchants and warriors. His account provides valuable outside confirmation of the extensive reach of Norse maritime technology. Ibn Fadlan describes the Rus as perfect physical specimens, tall as date palms, blond and ruddy. He records their arrival by ship, their commercial acumen, and their funeral practices, including a ship burial that offers independent verification of similar ceremonies described in Norse sagas. His detailed observations confirm that by the early 10th century, Norse maritime trade had penetrated deep into Eastern Europe and Central Asia, creating connections between previously isolated cultural spheres. The longship's reach extended even to the Mediterranean. In 859-862 CE, a fleet of Viking ships navigated through the Strait of Gibraltar and raided settlements along the coasts of Spain, North Africa, France, and Italy. They even attacked the Balearic Islands and sites in what is now Tunisia. This Mediterranean expedition demonstrates the remarkable range and capability of Norse vessels and crews. While other European powers were essentially regional in their maritime operations, the Vikings could operate effectively across the entire continent and beyond. Archaeological evidence for this Mediterranean presence is limited, but historical chronicles from multiple regions confirm the extent of Norse activity. The Arabic chronicler Ibn al-Qutiyya records Viking attacks on Seville in 844 CE, describing how the Magus, Vikings, came to Seville with their vessels. The Christian chronicler Prudentius of Troy similarly notes Norse raids in the Mediterranean in his Annals of St. Bertin. These independent accounts from different cultural perspectives confirm the historical reality of these far-ranging expeditions. As the Viking Age progressed, the longship itself continued to evolve. By the 10th and 11th centuries, specialized variants had emerged for different purposes. The classic longship remained the primary warship, optimized for speed and amphibious operations. But larger Nars developed specifically for trade, with deeper hulls for cargo capacity while maintaining the ability to beach on shorelines. Smaller fairings and sixerings served local transportation needs along the coasts. Each type maintained the fundamental innovations that made Norse ships superior while adapting to specific requirements. Archaeological finds from Skuldelev in Denmark provide examples of these specialized vessels. The Skuldelev I, a Nar, dating to around 1030 CE, had a cargo capacity of approximately 20 to 25 tons, while requiring a crew of only 5 to 8 men, an efficient trading vessel for its era. The Skuldelev V, a small warship from around the same period, represents the other end of the spectrum, a light, fast vessel optimized for coastal raiding and patrol duties. The impact of longship technology gradually diminished as other European powers adapted. By the late 10th century, Alfred the Great of Wessex had commissioned his own fleet of longships to counter Viking raids, studying and adopting Norse designs. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records for the year 896 CE that King Alfred ordered longships built to oppose the Danish ships. They were almost twice as long as the others. Some had 60 oars, some more. They were both swifter and steadier, and also higher than the others. This description reveals both the English recognition of Norse maritime superiority and their efforts to not just copy but improve upon Viking designs. The Frankish kingdoms similarly developed more effective naval forces. As European shipbuilding incorporated elements of the Norse approach, the overwhelming advantage the Vikings had initially enjoyed began to erode. Simultaneously, the Norse themselves were changing. As Viking raiders became settlers, traders, and eventually integrated members of European society, the original impetus for raiding diminished. The adoption of Christianity throughout Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries altered cultural values that had previously celebrated raiding. The consolidation of power under kings in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden created more centralized states focused on internal development rather than external expansion. The emerging European feudal order, with its emphasis on land-based power and territorial control, gradually supplanted the more fluid, maritime-oriented Norse social system. These cultural and political shifts reduced the motivation for maintaining the distinctive longship tradition, even as technical knowledge of how to build such vessels persisted. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 is often cited as the end of the Viking Age. When Harald Hardrada, king of Norway, attempted to claim the English throne, he was defeated by the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson on September 25th, just weeks before Harold himself would fall to William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings. The defeat at Stamford Bridge marked the last major Viking military expedition to England. While Norse maritime activity continued, the era of Viking raids had largely concluded. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Harold's invasion fleet consisted of more than 300 ships, yet this substantial force failed to establish a lasting Norse presence in England. The defeat demonstrated that the longship alone no longer guaranteed military success against prepared opponents who had adapted their defenses and developed their own naval capabilities. The legacy of the longship extended far beyond the Viking Age. Elements of Norse shipbuilding technology influenced European maritime development for centuries. The clinker-built construction method remained common in Northern Europe well into the 19th century. More broadly, the Vikings' achievement in creating vessels that could reliably cross open oceans set the stage for the age of exploration. While later European explorers used different ship designs, they followed a path first charted by Norse mariners. The psychological breakthrough of conceiving oceanic waters not as barriers, but as highways connecting distant lands, began with the Viking longship. Without this conceptual shift, the later European exploration of Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific might have been delayed by centuries. When Columbus sailed west in 1492, he did so in vessels that owed little to Norse design directly, but much to the maritime tradition of oceanic navigation that the Vikings had pioneered. The chronicles and sagas that record the Viking voyages remain valuable historical sources, though they must be interpreted carefully. Many were written down centuries after the events they describe, having been preserved through oral tradition. The Icelandic sagas in particular, compiled primarily in the 13th century, provide detailed accounts of earlier explorations, family histories, and conflicts. While they contain literary embellishments and sometimes supernatural elements, archaeological discoveries have repeatedly confirmed aspects of their accounts, suggesting a core of historical truth. The saga descriptions of ship construction, navigation techniques, and the logistics of long voyages offer insights that complement the archaeological record, helping modern historians reconstruct not just the physical reality of Viking ships, but the cultural context in which they operated. The most famous saga account of shipbuilding comes from the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, which describes the construction of the Long Serpent, an exceptional warship built for King Olaf around 998 CE. According to the saga, it was 34 rooms long, referring to rowing benches, indicating a much larger vessel than the Gokstad or Oseberg ships, with a gilded dragon head and tail. While the specific details may be exaggerated, archaeological evidence confirms that larger and more elaborate longships did develop by the late 10th century. The saga's description of the shipbuilding process offers valuable insights into both the technical and cultural aspects of Norse maritime technology. The Long Serpent had 34 rooms, the head and the tail were all gilt, and the bulwarks were as high as in seagoing ships. This was the best ship ever built in Norway, and the most costly. The sagas also preserve accounts of navigation techniques that supplement our archaeological understanding. Egil's saga describes how they had no sun and stars to steer by for many days, but drifted before the wind in thick weather and mist, eventually reaching land by observing changes in cloud patterns and wave structures. Similar accounts appear in multiple sagas, revealing that Norse navigators had developed sophisticated techniques for orientation even when celestial navigation was impossible. These descriptions are consistent with what modern anthropologists have observed among traditional navigators in other maritime cultures, suggesting that the saga accounts preserve genuine navigational knowledge rather than mere literary invention. The redundancy of these navigation systems, using sun, stars, wind patterns, wave behavior, wildlife, and coastal features, made Norse voyaging remarkably reliable even in the challenging conditions of the North Atlantic. As the seasons turned and generations passed, the great age of the Viking longship gradually faded. The warming climate that had facilitated Norse expansion began to reverse around 1250 CE, with the onset of the Little Ice Age, making northern navigation more difficult. Political changes throughout Europe reduced opportunities for raiding. The development of the cog, a new type of sailing ship with a stern rudder and higher sides, created vessels better suited to the growing trade of the Hanseatic League in the Baltic and North Sea regions. While these later ships incorporated some elements of Norse design, such as clinker construction, they represented a distinct maritime tradition oriented toward bulk cargo rather than the versatility of the longship. By the late medieval period, specialized military vessels had diverged significantly from merchant ships, ending the dual-purpose flexibility that had characterized the Viking approach. The changing religious landscape of Northern Europe also influenced shipbuilding traditions. The dragon heads and other pagan symbols that had adorned Viking vessels became less appropriate as Scandinavia embraced Christianity. While practical aspects of Norse maritime technology persisted, the cultural and symbolic dimensions that had made the longship distinctive gradually faded. Medieval Scandinavian illustrations show ships that retained some structural similarities to their Viking predecessors, but lacked the distinctive decorative elements that had once proclaimed Norse identity. The cultural continuity between pagan Norse shipwrights and their Christian descendants was broken, even as technical knowledge persisted in modified form. By the 13th century, the classic longship had become more ceremonial than practical for most purposes. The Norwegian ledang, a naval defense system based on coastal communities providing ships and crews, maintained some traditional vessel designs, but even these were increasingly influenced by newer shipbuilding traditions. The maritime technology that had once dominated northern waters became a memory preserved in sagas and burial mounds. Archaeological evidence shows that while clinker-built vessels continued to be constructed throughout Scandinavia, the distinctive proportions and design features of the classic longship gradually disappeared from common use. The revolutionary maritime technology that had enabled Viking expansion had been superseded by new designs better suited to the changing economic and political landscape of late medieval Europe. Yet the legacy of these remarkable vessels extends into our modern world in surprising ways. The fundamental approach of Viking shipwrights, building light, flexible hulls that work with the forces of wind and wave rather than against them, influences modern yacht design. Contemporary sailboats, with their emphasis on responsive handling and efficiency, owe more to the Viking tradition than to the heavier, more rigid vessels that dominated much of European maritime history. The Vikings' empirical approach to improving their vessels through careful observation and incremental changes parallels modern engineering methodologies. Their navigation techniques, developed without instruments, demonstrate the remarkable capacity of human beings to understand and work with the natural environment. Modern reconstructions of Viking ships have provided new insights into their capabilities. Projects like the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, Denmark, have built and tested accurate replicas of vessels based on archaeological finds. These experimental archaeology projects have confirmed what historical sources suggested, that Viking ships were indeed remarkably seaworthy and capable of the voyages attributed to them in historical accounts. The Heffingsten fra Glendalough, sea stallion from Glendalough, a reconstruction of the Skuldelev II ship, sailed from Denmark to Dublin in 2007-2008, retracing the route of its original. The voyage demonstrated both the capabilities and challenges of Norse maritime technology, with the ship achieving impressive speeds under favorable conditions while requiring constant maintenance and skilled handling. These practical experiments have enriched our understanding of Viking seafaring beyond what could be gleaned from archaeological remains alone. The psychological impact of the longship has also endured in cultural memory. The dragon-headed prow has become an instantly recognizable symbol of the Viking Age, appearing everywhere from sports team logos to Hollywood productions. It represents both the terror these vessels once inspired and a grudging admiration for their creators' ingenuity. Few technological innovations in history have so completely transformed the power dynamics of their era as the Viking longship did in the early Middle Ages. The cultural memory of these ships persists in literature, art, and popular imagination, sometimes romanticized, sometimes demonized, but always recognized as transformative. Modern replica Viking ships drawing crowds at maritime festivals around the world testify to the enduring fascination these vessels inspire, even among people with no direct connection to Norse heritage. In museums across Scandinavia, the recovered remains of these ancient vessels continue to draw visitors from around the world. Standing before the preserved timbers of the Gokstad or Oseberg ships, Modern observers can still sense the revolution these vessels represented, the vision, skill, and daring that allowed their builders and crews to redraw the map of the known world. The ships themselves stand as silent witnesses to a time when Nordic innovation conquered the constraints of geography and weather. The preservation of these artifacts, rescued from burial mounds where they had lain for a millennium, represents one of archaeology's great achievements. Through careful conservation techniques, these fragile wooden structures have been stabilized for future generations to study and admire, providing tangible connections to the maritime revolution that reshaped medieval Europe. For coastal communities in early medieval Europe, the sight of Viking longships on the horizon represented an approaching catastrophe, swift, unpredictable, and nearly impossible to counter. For modern historians, these same vessels represent one of history's most successful adaptations to environmental challenge, a technology perfectly suited to its time and context. For the Norse themselves, the longship was both practical tool and cultural symbol, embodying their relationship with the sea and their place in the world. The ships were often given names, Long Serpent, Raven, Wolf, and treated almost as living entities with their own personalities and spirits. They featured prominently in Norse poetry and art, celebrated not just for their utility, but for their beauty and the freedom they represented. When a prominent chieftain or king died, his ship might become his final resting place, buried in a mound with grave goods for the afterlife, a practice that has fortunately preserved several examples for modern study. The technological advantage provided by the longship reminds us that history's course is often altered not by grand philosophical movements or the ambitions of rulers, but by practical innovations that change what is physically possible. Before the longship, the Norse were largely confined to their Scandinavian homeland. With it, they became a continental power whose influence stretched from Newfoundland to the Caspian Sea, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. Few technological innovations have so dramatically expanded the reach of a culture. The Viking longship did not simply improve on existing capabilities, it fundamentally redefined the relationship between land and sea, between coastal and inland regions. It transformed water from a barrier to a highway, from a defensive feature to a vulnerability. This maritime revolution reshaped the political, economic, and cultural landscape of medieval Europe in ways that continue to influence our world today. Today, as we face our own environmental challenges and seek sustainable ways to harness natural forces, the Viking longship offers inspiration. It reminds us that human ingenuity, working with natural principles, rather than against them, can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The Norse shipwrights created their revolutionary vessels not through conquering nature, but through deeply understanding it, an approach that may serve our modern world well as we navigate our own uncertain waters. The longship's design principles, lightweight construction, flexibility, and efficiency, align remarkably well with contemporary emphasis on sustainable technologies that minimize resource use while maximizing performance. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Viking maritime revolution is that transformative innovation often comes not from imposing human will upon the natural world, but from aligning human creativity with natural forces. As the northern lights dance above the fjords where the Viking Age began, we might imagine the spirits of those ancient mariners looking out over a world they helped shape. Their legacy sails on, in our languages, our laws, our DNA, and our continuing fascination with their achievements. While other fleets waited on the tide, the Vikings sailed against the wind, charting a course that would transform the medieval world and echo down through the centuries to our own time. In a harsh environment that might have confined a less resourceful people, they created a maritime technology that expanded their horizon to encompass half the known world. The Viking longship stands as testament to human ingenuity and adaptability, qualities that enabled a relatively small population from the northern edge of Europe to leave an outsized imprint on history that persists more than a millennium after the last dragon-headed prow cut through the waters of the North Sea.